Israel has talked before about how a nuclear Pakistan can be a threat. Don't underestimate the Israel lobby, the multiple points of access in the US that Israel.
I'm joined by Daniel Levy today, the president of US Middle East Project and Israel's one of most important peace negotiators. He served under Prime Ministers Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Barak and was part of Israel's negotiating team back in Oslo B process as well as 2001 Taba talks. Over the years, he has become one of the most vocal and prominent commentator on Middle East conflict resolution. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. I want to take you to Bergenstock. What did you make of the images that we all saw?
I think the main takeaway is the fact that that meeting took place and that it happened in the context of the implementation of this Islamabad memorandum of understanding, and that after 110 days of an ill-conceived war, which never should have happened in the first place, numerous American presidents didn't buy what the Israeli leadership, and particularly Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu, was selling them. They didn't get sucked into this war. This president did. But 30, and let's think about this for a moment. It was about 38, 39 days of the active military attack. After that, it already became clear that America was heading for a strategic defeat, that the war plans weren't working. We've actually subsequently had over 70 days of this kind of tentative ceasefire without an actual deal. But now you have a deal. And I think for most people around the world looking at this, they have felt the ripple effects, the shock waves in inflation, in energy costs, in having every country almost having to rejuggle their economy and the workings of that economy. And we were expecting an even greater shock. So this is going to be very delicate, very sensitive, very fragile. But there is the what to build on now. Seeing the Iranians, seeing the Americans, having those who had mediated this, of course, the state of Pakistan, of course, the intensive efforts of Qatar. You had both the Qatari and the Pakistani prime ministers in Switzerland. It gives you the basis to try and make this permanent, which doesn't mean it will be easy to implement and to get an agreement on the MOU. But I don't think it's really a secret. You probably don't need to see all 14 of the clauses of that agreement implemented in order to prevent the war from resuming. And it's thickening the thin ice, thickening the layers of the thin ice on which everyone is currently skating. That's what Switzerland was primarily about, I would argue.
I want to talk about February 28th when it all began. When you heard that the attack has finally happened, led by Israel, US involved, did you think that it's going to be one of those episodes like it happened in 2025? Because that was a 12-day war. Did you think this will be over in 14 days? Or did you think back then, okay, US has completely miscalculated this, and this is going to go over for months now?
Well, there was an important word in your question, which is when it finally happened. And there was the expectation, the anticipation that this was becoming inevitable. And there was a sense that this looked different from June 2025. First of all, in June 2025, it was an Israeli attack. It took 11 days to pull the Americans in, and the Americans came in for a quick escalate to de-escalate. And that was kind of clearly signaled. The American strike against Iran, Iran made a kind of almost symbolic response on the American base, the Al Udeid base in Qatar. This was different if you look at the extent of the American military buildup in the region leading to Feb 28th, and then the language that was used, the incredibly high bar that was set primarily by the Israeli prime minister, but at different times, the US president and the circles around him flowed in behind many of those goals. I think it was difficult to tell at the time how long it would last, but many of us at the outset of this war, said, wait a minute, don't expect this to go easily for the US Israeli side. Just go back and do a bit of history. The hubris that you quite often see from Western powers, the specific hubris that one sees from Israel in the region, the underestimating of the adversary, and the inattention to detail of what it means to go into asymmetric warfare. No one had any doubt on Feb 28th as to the respective firepower. But what you had to understand was that Iran was not going to try and meet America and Israel weapon for weapon, attack for attack. That they had a finely tuned way of conducting asymmetric warfare under these conditions. They deployed it, it was effective, and it was very soon revealed that the US and Israel didn't have the answer. The most obvious part of that being the successful Iranian closure, effectively, of the Strait of Hormuz, and the allergy, let's call it, the unwillingness, and in this he was right, President Trump, to put troops on the ground. And so Iran, in that respect, had a distinct advantage. Also, of course, the fact that you had so many American bases in close proximity to Iran, precisely because of this potential war scenario, that made for very accessible targets, even if that meant Iran, therefore, conducting operations, sending missiles against its Gulf neighbors. And that obviously has played into Gulf Iran relations. But it also has everyone scratching their head as to how useful is this American security guarantee. So, yes, the expectation that this was not going to necessarily be the cakewalk that the US and Israel had depicted it.
You just spoke about what happened with the Middle East, and in your article for The Guardian, you wrote that Gulf being hit by Iranian missiles is not a mere glitch, it was by design. Could you explain what you meant by that? And was there a, a party that was trying to actively engineer that?
Right. So I have thought, of written quite extensively about how one should understand the project currently being pursued by the Israeli leadership that they openly acknowledge is a Greater Israel project. Now, the obvious go-to place when you hear that terminology is, this means territorial expansion. Greater Israel. Israel takes up more land. And part of it is that. And of course, the attempt to displace the zero sum project against the Palestinians is in significant part to achieve an Israel that extends across the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and now Gaza also, where Israel continues to occupy over 2/3 of Gaza, to kill Palestinians every day. But there's another way in which this works. And it's partly because of this zero sum eradicationist approach to the Palestinians that Israel knows that the only way it can impose that is by achieving hard power domination in the region. And to do that, what Israel is pursuing is a regional reality in which the other regional states are either collapsed states, states that essentially don't function and therefore can't pose a threat. It's not only Israel that's contributed to this. I'm not attributing to Israel primacy in the Syrian civil war, for instance, or the collapse of Yemen or Libya. It was certainly involved in the collapse of Iraq 2 decades ago. But this is what it hoped would happen in Iran. The other piece of that is the states that are left standing see that they have no choice but to accept Israel's primacy. And therefore, you create relations of dependency. It's tried to do that with Egypt, Jordan, and elsewhere. And Israel went into this, as anyone who follows this closely would, anticipating that Iran would respond with missiles into the Gulf states that host an American military presence. So this wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a surprise to the GCC states They are the ones who had gone to the Americans and counseled against this war. So Israel went into this expecting Iran to launch those missiles, but expecting Iran to be summarily defeated and expecting those Gulf states to then say, you know what? We have no choice. Israel has shown its dominance. Some of us may be enthusiastic, some of us may be less enthusiastic, but all of us are going to have to see Israel as part of our security shield and perhaps switch some of our, even how we get oil out to market to Israeli ports and things like that. That is not how it's worked out. The Gulf feels quite divided now. And many Gulf states look back at this and say, yes, we have a problem with Iran, but we're going to have to work out how we deal with that. Perhaps investments are going to be part of it. But we also have a problem with Israel. Not only is Israel doing things with the Palestinians, which have a deeply radicalizing and destabilizing effect, but they're now doing things like pulling America into this war, which directly, fundamentally, existentially undermine our national security. And therefore, the question becomes, will you see some kind of unified effort, not everyone, but among some of the states, to contain and deter Israel? It's too early to say whether that will happen. Israel is betting they won't get their act together. I'm not so sure.
Well, when you speak about Israel, Netanyahu was openly speaking about alternate routes to the closure of Strait of Hormuz or the choke point that it became. How close or how central was the energy routes for this design of the war that we saw?
That is going to be one of the things to look at now in the coming weeks, months, years. These things are not turned around overnight. After what we saw with Hormuz in the coming years, you are going to see new, I imagine, pipeline nodalities built in all kinds of directions. Netanyahu, if I take people back just under 3 years, Netanyahu has tried to create this kind of seamless uh, flow of connectivity. And it was announced in the margins of the Indian hosted G20 meeting in Delhi in September of 2023. This all gets lost because the following month is October 7th and everything looks different. But it's been talked about again during this war. And it's the announcement of something called IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. There's close relations between India, UAE, Israel. That was going to be a central plank, but this was designed to bring in Saudi and others. Netanyahu then goes and talks in boastful terms that this is going to happen at the UN General Assembly in September of 2023. And in the context of this war, Netanyahu appears and he says the solution to Hormuz is to route at least some of the flow of energy to market through the Israeli ports on the Mediterranean. So he's openly making a play for this. Yeah, whether that looks more attractive than obviously some will go east, but if you want to go in that direction, are you better off going to Israel or are you better off going through Iraq, Syria to Turkey? Those will be the competing attempts to assert the future of energy transport out of the West Asia Gulf region. But it's also why, or one of the reasons why, along with the need to think about how to contain Israel, along with perhaps the sense that you need a third bloc in the region that's neither Israeli led nor Iranian led, that we saw again this weekend, the fourth meeting of the foreign ministers of Pakistan, Saudi, Egypt, and Turkey. That meeting took place in Cairo. I don't want to suggest that that grouping is translating into a military alliance, but it will be interesting to follow where those countries go in their thinking about their positionality and the geopolitics of
Right.
the region.
I want to talk about April 7th now, because that was the date when all of us were a little on edge when Donald Trump said that he was going to annihilate a whole civilization. And that would have had consequences not just on Iran, but on the whole region. And then 90 minutes before that deadline was supposed to be met, he goes on to Truth Social and says that after talks with Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and CDF Asim Munir, he's willing for a 2-week ceasefire. What was going through your mind? Did you really think Donald Trump was going to go on and do it? Or did you think that something is happening in the background, some sort of a diplomatic thing between Pakistan and the American President Donald Trump? What was your thought process during that time?
By that time, we were already aware that on several occasions, Trump had made these threats and then pulled back. We were also uh, subjected to endless expressions of optimism by the president. So I think by the time we got the deal, it was about the 40th occasion on which Trump said, "We're about to get a deal." Of course, we were also deeply steeped in the president endlessly telling us how he'd won. Last June, when there was the brief strike, June, July of 2025, President Trump tells us everything's destroyed, it's done, and then criticizes, what he calls the fake media, who raised some questions as to whether that was really the case. What I'm speaking to here is the unique style of this president. Now, some people will say, look, it can be quite effective. And occasionally that is the case. But mostly what we're seeing is also a lack of strategy. So the inconsistency, the unpredictability, and the extremes of the statements are not just tactical. They also speak at a deep level to, let's just call it what it is. This is not an administration that really does serious policy planning and thinking through and implementation and management. And you saw when in the trade wars, the US, there's Liberation Day, and then they have to back down, especially with China. The US blinks first. And so, what's crucial in the mediation, in that very active channel between Islamabad and Washington, D.C., is that at pivotal moments, it gave Trump the ladder. And it was a ladder that it seemed he was often looking for. Okay, so sometimes he's used the direct Islamabad channel. Sometimes he's used calls with the leaders more broadly in West Asia. So he'd say, I've just got off the phone with MBS of Saudi Arabia, MBZ of UAE, my friend the Emir of Qatar, my friends in Pakistan, in Turkey, etc. And they've asked me, and you know what? They're good people, and I'm going to give this another chance. But we were already in April 7th in a place where the US was stuck. It didn't know how to get out of this. It doesn't mean that it was impossible that it could have escalated. And it doesn't mean that it's impossible that today it will still escalate. But not because it actually has a strategy whereby escalation sufficiently reshuffles the deck that it creates new opportunities. No, it would be escalation to serve the news cycle. And so if something else can replace escalation to serve the news cycle, then we are all spared the very significant knock-on effects of continued war and escalation. And I think the other thing that we have to be cognizant of is that, yes, Iran's economy has taken a bigger hit. Iran has faced greater destruction. But pain thresholds do not look the same in Tehran as they do in Washington, D.C. So the pain threshold economically in Washington, especially when politics and the politics of a midterm election year kick in, that pain threshold can be quite low, actually. The rest of the world, meanwhile, says, yeah, how do we manage with an America that is apparently totally indifferent or perhaps takes some pleasure in the knock-on effects where whole economies are sometimes having to scale down their production because of energy shortages? You're there in Pakistan. It's not just Pakistan. Across significant swathes of the world, people who have nothing to do with this conflict have paid a price and have suffered, and everyone therefore has to manage it. And in that respect, luckily, certain people, certain leaders who have put their best foot forward in terms of trying to achieve de escalation have the ear of this president.
I'd like to talk about Netanyahu, and so, we all know this isn't the end game. The Islamabad memorandum is just a part of this chess game that has been happening for the last 3 months. And Netanyahu has said time and again that he doesn't like Pakistan or the role that it's playing in this region. How is Pakistan coming out now? And I mean, J.D. Vance literally said that there's one Pakistani that he's been in touch with, and it's Asim Munir, and an Indian that he speaks to is his wife. And how is that being seen by Netanyahu or his team or Israel? And are they happy with what's going on? And are they counting on the fact that before the end game, this could all fall apart?
This has gone on for 3 months. For Netanyahu, it's gone on for more than 3 decades. He and what we have to understand is yes, there is an obsession with Iran, but also Iran has been a fantastic tool for diverting and distracting attention from what Israel does to the Palestinians. So even in the weekly management of Israeli international diplomacy, folks will be in a bilateral meeting with the Israelis, and they'll say, "Look, what's going on in the West Bank?" The Israelis say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa. First we talk about Iran." So Iran has played this role. Now, Netanyahu, I think, especially looked. If I'm now fast forwarding to this Trump second administration, he looked at that first visit that Trump took as a major international visit. And he went to the Gulf and they signed in the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia huge deals, huge projects, the kind of thing that we very associate with President Trump. Not all of them will see the light of the day, but he didn't go to Israel. And I think Netanyahu began to worry that in the Gulf, in Islamabad, in Ankara, Turkey, there were a set of relationships being built which perhaps could have as much access to the ear of the American president as that which comes from Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And Netanyahu worked to set up an alternative to convince Trump of the fun of going to war. That's why June 2025 was so important. It's only after that that Trump does what he does in Venezuela, conducts operations in Nigeria, and of course then joins this big second war. As a result of the outcome of this war, Netanyahu is going in even heavier. But here I want to point out something that I think is very significant because Israel goes to an election in September, October. This isn't playing well for Netanyahu. But we sometimes focus too much on the person of Netanyahu. Goes deep into the Israeli system. Much of the criticism of Netanyahu is his opposition outflanking him from the right, saying, "Why don't you stand up to the American president in Beirut in terms of bombing Lebanon? Why have you said yes to this?" So the Israeli position, whether it's extreme positions on Qatar or Turkey or Pakistan, goes well beyond Netanyahu. And Pakistan is now on the radar screen in West Asia and the Middle East in ways that it has previously probably not been. Israel tried to pull India deeply into the West Asia equation. And the events of the last months have now pulled Pakistan more into that equation. Now, India, by the way, if called to take sides between the UAE and Saudi, it's uncomfortable doing that. So it doesn't want to be involved in some of these internal frictions. It's aligned itself closely with Israel. Many people have talked about the alliance between Zionism and Hindutva. That undoubtedly is a factor. But if one rolls the reel back a little further, Israel has talked before about how a nuclear Pakistan can be a threat. So as Israel begins to map out what begins to look like real overreach. Because are you telling me that Israel, even with its top military tech and its top cyber and hacking and uh, you know, being able to break into others' security systems, tech, with all of that, a country of 10 million can really simultaneously take on almost the entirety of its neighborhood, take on important parts of the Gulf, take on Turkey, take on Iran, and add Pakistan to the list of countries it wants to take on and undermine their role. This is beginning to look like the kind of overreach where Israel may really fall flat on its face. And it is encouraging, and this is what I was trying to suggest before, it is encouraging these other countries to at least begin to take seriously the idea that something must be done to contain Israel's extreme and excessive ambitions in this region. And all of that comes after so much of the world, and if I may say, so much of the not only, but especially in some ways, the Muslim world has been every day watching those images coming out of Gaza on our devices, how ubiquitous these just egregious scenes of cruelty, of gratuitous cruelty. People have been watching that, and Israel is creating a world of pain for itself, and it doesn't yet apparently feel the need for a course shift. And I think that's the big challenge in the next period.
Right. And before I let you go, I'm going to ask this because I have to, because there was many instances during since February 28th that many of the analysts thought that okay, there will be no more deal, that this could all fall apart. Was there any instances that you thought that the deal might not happen and it's all downhill from here?
I wish I could answer that question exclusively in the past tense, but I think it's a question that is very much still alive today. So at the moment, the place where it's going to be most tested seems to be Lebanon, right? So every time a deal got closer, Israel would do something that would try to undermine the deal. And the attacks in Beirut in the final days of closing the deal fall exactly into that category of was there something that could unravel all of this? Those things will continue. And I think that's the point. The point is that you need the constant, I don't know, should we call it babysitting? Should we call it Bibi sitting? That he is not given the wiggle room to undermine this. And where I think this is going to be particularly tested and tricky is that Israel wants to have an equation where, while Israel is still deep militarily inside Lebanese sovereign territory, that Israel will be able to maintain that, but that any resistance, Hezbollah or otherwise, to the Israeli presence will be considered a violation of the deal, but Israel's illegal occupation won't be considered a violation. So we see how the previous Lebanon ceasefire, we see how the ceasefire in Gaza, ceasefire, I think in quotation marks, Palestinians being killed every day, Lebanese being killed every day, a quarter of the population still displaced. It doesn't work. You can't have an equation where you have an illegal, aggressive occupation of another state's sovereign territory and you expect a ceasefire and an absence of resistance to prevail. Look, Israel will use all the other levers it has with the US, and it may well be.
But are they at that point? I mean, there's a lot happening between the two countries at this point, where Israel is completely unhappy with the deal, and the United States, including J.D. Vance and President Donald Trump, they're saying that they absolutely want this deal because, as you said it yourself, Donald Trump didn't know how to get out of it, and now he has a way to get out. But Israel doesn't want it. So, will they listen to Israel again?
That's where so much of this is going to play out. And I would say it's premature for me or anyone else to give you a definitive answer because some of what we are seeing is new territory. We just haven't been here before, where you have everything about the Trump second administration is different, okay? But the language being used, in particular by the vice president, by the way, about Israel, the divergence of Israel US interests, the fact that within the MAGA world, it's the America first that's now regaining primacy over the Israel first. But, and this is the thing that during these days I've been trying to point out to people, but don't underestimate the Israel lobby, the multiple points of access in the US that Israel has, the ability to play in different arena, the density of that embeddedness of Israel in the US system. So, under President Obama, Netanyahu went to Congress against the president in 2015 and spoke out against the JCPOA deal. He couldn't have been more aggressive. A year later, Obama is signing the largest ever American package of security assistance to Israel. Now, things have changed in the last decade. Public opinion has shifted dramatically. There's, as we know, a big fight inside MAGA, the Democrat voting constituency, fed up with Israel, fed up with the relationship. But you have pro-Israel forces buying up American legacy and new media. You have campaign finance. You have the American narrative, which is anyway so deeply steeped in a kind of Zionist, Judeo-Christian civilization. So game on. What I would say is game on. Israel is going to try and advance an agenda which says, you know what? We swallowed hard. We didn't like this deal. We didn't upend it. Now you owe us. And it sounds fantastical to think that would play. But it might. The Americans may come at this and say, you're right, we owe you. What can we do to make you happy? And maybe as a closing thought, my worry is that so often what that translates into is the Palestinians become the punching bag. Because what we still don't hear is an American narrative which acknowledges Palestinian humanity, the realities over there, what Israel is doing. And that's the easiest place for Israel to take it out on people. They can take it out on the Americans can take it out on the Iranian football team, but beyond the World Cup, Israel takes this out on the Palestinians, and it does that anyway without encouragement. But how much worse might it yet get?
That makes sense. Thank you so much, Daniel. This has been amazing.